Hello, Dog Nation. I am Brandon Adams, and this is not Dog Nation Daily. What am I doing? We already did that today. We are in a good mood, though, because this is exactly what National Signing Day is all about. This is a Kroger commitment special for us, a signing day special here, as five-star edge rusher Damon Wilson has done what many thought he would do, that is picking the Georgia Bulldogs. A moment ago, the Georgia Bulldogs adding a big name to this class of 2023. When you looked at what could happen here on this start to the early signing period, this was obviously the moment that had everybody's attention, how things would go with Wilson, who had been a Georgia-Ohio State battle down the stretch with at one point in time. It may even been that Ohio State led in this battle, and yet Georgia remained steadfast in this recruitment the entire time and emerges as the victors for Wilson, the very impressive prospect coming out of Venice, Florida here. So a big ad for Georgia, a Kroger commitment special for us reacting to all of this. We're going to get Jeff Sintel, connect with him, and coming up in just a moment. In fact, when Jeff is ready to go, they'll let me know, and we'll start talking to him as Georgia does what it needs to do by adding Damon Wilson. Really exciting. A couple thoughts from me here to kind of get things going. First of all, I think when you start thinking about like the positions that really matter in college football, when you think about your so-called premium positions, there are a few that quickly come to mind. Obviously, quarterback at the top of that list. I would say in recent years, wide receiver has kind of become one of those. I think the offensive tackle positions have kind of been viewed that way. I think from here on out, I think you have to view the edge rusher position as that. In fact, we've kind of seen a little bit of change in recent years in terms of how the recruiting services even classify players like Wilson. Like at one point in time, there were weak side defensive ends, there were outside linebackers, there were guys who were kind of classified, in a little bit different way. But within that was the last year or so, we've seen, the 24/7s and the websites that do this. We've seen them kind of starting to put all of these guys in a different kind of category, much cooler sounding name, right? You call them edge rushers now because that's really what they do. And in different defenses, they may wear a different position label, but ultimately their job is the same thing. They go after quarterbacks, and that's what Wilson is going to be able to do for Georgia. So it is a premium position, and it was a position of need for the Dogs. In fact, a little earlier on the video today, we talked to Dog Nation's Connor Riley about some of the things that Kirby Smart had said at his press conference that he did today to kind of put the bow and the finishing touches on National Signing Day. And in that particular conversation, one of the things that Smart did not shy away from is that Georgia wanted to replenish its roster with outside linebackers, with edge rushers. It wanted to bring more of those guys in. It was a need for Georgia going into this class. I think we would all say that the need has been met emphatically here. By adding Samuel Mpemba, by adding Gabe Harris, by now adding Damon Wilson, Georgia has looked at what it viewed as a need and addressed it in a gigantic fashion. And what I kind of find to be fascinating here is that at one point in time, you want to go back a couple of months ago, I think I probably would have said the number one story, if you could kind of whittle it down to only one thing for this 2023 class from Georgia, if it can only be about one thing, then maybe it's about bringing in as good a trio of inside linebackers as maybe I've seen in one class at one time. Raylan Wilson and Troy Bowles and obviously C.J. Allen. That a collection of inside linebackers like that may be as good as any program has ever brought in at any one time. And yet now that the finishing touches are starting to be put on this class, all of a sudden you say, well, what Georgia's doing at the edge rusher spot is just as deep and just as impressive as maybe what it did at the inside linebacker spot. That gives you an idea of just how impressive it is what Georgia has done by bringing in a guy like Wilson to go along with what it already has with Harris and Mpemba officially signing with Georgia here today. So that's a big celebration. We're going to get Jeff Sintel here coming up in just a moment. I'll also remind you this is our Kroger Signing Day special. We've been reacting throughout the day on video to some of the big news around the Georgia class and this class of 2023. And, of course, Kroger excited about all of that, and they are excited as well about the upcoming Christmas season and the holiday season that'll take place all throughout the rest of this year. And, of course, as you're getting stocked up for all the fun that you're going to have, the decorations to go around the house, the food that goes on the table for that special meal you have planned with friends and family, the gifts, those last-minute gift items, which are always so difficult and challenging to buy for. Whatever you have as a need, Kroger's ready to meet that for you. In fact, you can stop by in store right now and see not only all kinds of great holiday options, but great savings as well. You can also begin your shopping experience online by going to Kroger.com/holiday. That's Kroger.com/holiday. And you can enjoy an amazing time. So Kroger bringing all that to you, and they bring this recruiting coverage to us here on National Signing Day as well. I think the team on the other side of this, and we don't have Jeff Santel yet, is that right? All right, so we don't have Jeff yet. We might want to reach out to him and see if he's ready to join us. But I think the other team on the other side of this is also a bit interesting too. This is Ohio State, which loses out on Wilson. Some of their fans had been on message boards in recent days kind of waving the white flag of surrender on the Wilson recruitment as it is. But Ryan Day's also been backpedaling a little bit today already because of some other recruiting losses that they've taken and some decommitments. And, Ryan Day was kind of caught saying something to the effect of, hey, it didn't used to be this way around the Big Ten. And a lot of folks have kind of stepped up to say, well, Ohio State's really the program that changed all that. When Urban Meyer was hired years ago, the kind of gentleman's agreement that used to exist in the Big Ten about we don't go after other guys' recruits, that kind of changed with Urban Meyer, and all of a sudden it sort of seems like Ohio State saying, hey, y'all are playing too rough. But the way all of this is going are with the rules that Ohio State's the unofficial rules anyway, that Ohio State kind of put in place here. So I think that we are looking at a little bit of a kind of an interesting landscape for Ohio State, and maybe not the best day they were hoping for. I don't know that they necessarily expected to get Wilson. But this is certainly an interesting day for Ohio State as they're kind of having to pick up the pieces here, losing some decommitments, and for Ryan Day trying to make sense of how Ohio State fits into this current recruiting landscape. We'll get Jeff Santel in a moment. We also have Connor Riley going to join us here as well. Connor, let me bring you in on what I was just saying. Obviously, there's a lot to talk about with Damon Wilson, but how about the other team on this, Ohio State? This has kind of traditionally been one of these major recruiting battles or I should say powers that Georgia expects to be doing battle with. Maybe not the best day for the Buckeyes, and Ryan Day's had to kind of put a little bit of a spin on that. What do you make of the team that Georgia beat head-to-head for Damon Wilson and Ohio State here?
BA, maybe I'm confused. Maybe something happened, but Ryan Day is sounding a lot like Dan Mullen right now, and that's not who you want to be sounding like on National Signing Day. He was bemoaning earlier today the fact that other schools recruit guys that are committed when, ironically, Ohio State had just poached Washington's quarterback commit. I mean, look, this is a bad loss for Ohio State, a program that for the past decade has done a really good job of recruiting edge rushers, guys like Chase Young, the Bosa brothers. Zach Harrison was once upon a time a five-star prospect there. And for Georgia to just come in here when, yes, it's a position of need for them as well, but for them to come in and land Damon Wilson when they already have a Sam Mpemba committed, when they already have a Gabe Harris committed, I think that's really concerning for the Buckeyes, where this was Georgia, saying, hey, come be a part of what makes Georgia great, as opposed to Ohio State, which I think has done a better job of churning out stars. But with the recent track record of success that Georgia has had on the defensive side of the football and the ability for Wilson to come in and play early, which he has at that outside linebacker position, it just made it too much for Ohio State to overcome. And so when you're Ohio State, when you're losing to Michigan on the field, and now you're losing recruiting battles that you've usually won for the past decade, it starts to get really concerning. And if they go out and lose to Ohio or to Georgia in the way I think they do, and granted, we've talked about this already, how I think this game might be more of a blowout than you do. If that happens, they're not going to fire Ryan Day, but things start to get real uncomfortable for him really quickly there, sort of in the same way they did for Dan Mullen there at the end of his tenure at Florida.
No, I think you're absolutely right about that. This is a little bit of a weird look for Ohio State right now. I don't deny that. You wrote a great story about this at DogNation.com. Now, I want to be careful as someone who obviously would love to see Ohio State implode in recruiting and would love to see them lose in the Peach Bowl there as well. As a fan of this team, I want to try to be careful not to try to draw too much from, Georgia just beat Ohio State for recruit, and therefore it makes it more likely they're going to win on the field there too. I want to be careful not to do that because, some of this just sort of feels like maybe an overcorrection after Ohio State, I would say, was overly praised coming into the year. On the heels of losing to Michigan and losing a couple of recruits and a couple of weird moments for Ryan Day, it sort of feels like there's a little bit too aggressive of a market correction now the other way, but hard not to notice. Things have not been trending well for the Buckeyes. You had Dylan Raiola into this, obviously, the 2024 decommit, and now Georgia beats Ohio State for Damon Wilson. It has not been a good stretch for Ohio State. You can't help but notice that.
Right. And again, this is Ohio State that is still going to end up signing a top 5 recruiting class. They have, 3 top 60 wide receivers coming in there once again. They're continuing to do what they've done well. But I do think that, again, this is an Ohio State program that has been living at the top for so long. And you're starting to see some cracks there. Now, maybe they call our friends up at ESOG and get them to come fix those and check those out. But I do think that it's with the way this program is trending, in the sense that, maybe they are being a little bit more of a finesse program. They've been out tough both physically in 2021 and then mentally, I think, in 2022 against Michigan. And now with the way this recruiting class sets up, where they don't have that dominant edge rusher coming in, the guy in the trenches to help really, combat some of this toughness talk that we've heard go against them. And you see him go to a program like Georgia where all they preach is mental and physical toughness. And yeah, they might not have the wide receivers and skill position talent that Ohio State does, but at the end of the day, when you look up on the scoreboard, Georgia's still beating you regardless because of how well this defense plays. And largely you are correct. Ohio State losing one recruiting battle to Georgia does not signify the doom and gloom. But I think when we step back, and again, this, Ohio State could very well come out and win against Georgia on December 31st. It was, again, this time last year, Michigan goes out and beats Georgia for a commit in Raylan Wilson that Georgia wanted badly. Well, Georgia comes back. They ultimately beat Michigan in that college football playoff game a year ago, and they ultimately end up getting Raylan Wilson in the class today. So this one result has, as you were correct, no bearing on the Peach Bowl as a whole. But I think when you step back and start to look at the full picture and what we both think Georgia wins that game. And if Georgia does win that game and Ohio State loses once again to a more physical opponent, you start to have to ask some really hard questions about what exactly is going on there for Ryan Day at Ohio State.
Sounds like Jeff is waiting to be led to the broadcast, so we'll bring him in and let him be a part of our conversation here too. Connor, one of the other things that I mentioned a moment ago before you joined us when we were just kind of getting started is when you make a list of like the premium positions in college football, it kind of begins and ends with quarterback, of course, and there's a lot of attention that gets paid to wide receiver, and you can maybe make a list of other positions that are on there. But to me, what makes the Damon Wilson news so significant is the fact that I think it comes at a position, not only a position of need for Georgia, but a position that's, I think, importance in college football is really growing here. The fact that we even call them edge rushers now, a little bit different than we would have labeled players like this maybe in recent years. I think it speaks to how it's becoming more and more important. And in any given year, trying to sign the very best edge rushers is the kind of thing that I think will be the exclusive domain of the best programs in college football and really a prerequisite to be considered among the best teams in college football, I believe.
Right. Kirby Smart said it today in his press conference. This Georgia program has been at their best when they have 3 to 4 guys like Damon Wilson in that 6'3", 240-plus range that are able to not just contribute in a variety of ways on defense, whether it be as a run stopper on first and second down or a guy that comes off the edge in third down, but help out on special teams. You think back even to last year with the way that team was built, Nolan Smith, Adam Anderson, Robert Beal, they were incredibly deep at that edge rusher position. They've eroded there a little bit. They have had some recruiting struggles in recent years. But for Chidera Uzo-Duribe, the first-year outside linebackers coach from Georgia, to come in and land the recruits that he landed, Gabe Harris out of IMG Academy in Valdosta, Sam Mpemba out of IMG there as well, and now Damon Wilson, who might be the most day one ready out of all of them, to come in and bring that level of talent in one recruiting class, I think speaks a lot to where Georgia is trying to get to, as you point out, with these edge rushers going forward, where, again, you are stacked at this position each and every year. Because if there is a weakness right now in this current Georgia defense, they're not great at getting pressure from the outside. Robert Beal and Chaz Chambliss aren't the sack pressurers that, say, Nolan Smith was. And the fact is, things are so bad there with Marvin Jones Jr. being banged up, they're actually having to move Jalen Walker down to that edge rusher position. So the fact that they go in and show up what I think was their biggest team weakness speaks volumes to how Georgia values this position going forward.
Let me bring in Jeff Sentell here, our Dog Nation recruiting insider. Jeff, we've been talking a little bit about the edge rusher position and Georgia getting the win over Ohio State. We haven't probably talked enough yet, though, about Wilson individually. You've had a chance to spend time with him. You've seen him play. You've been around him. What do you, I guess, stands out in your mind about Damon Wilson? And what do you think that Georgia fans ought to know about the player that Georgia has just added here?
I think he's an alpha. I think he is first of all, we kind of look, he has all the measurables. He's about 6'4", about 235. For me, what he's got is elite production in Florida's highest classification. Brandon and Connor, his two teams played for the state championship, both his junior and senior years. I think he has 270 career tackles. Here's one that just jumps out for a 3-year starter. He has 31 career sacks at the high school level. 410 on the bench press, 550 on the squat. I think Sinclair is going to love this guy. I think Dog fans are going to love this guy because I think he's the 5-star that everybody's like, oh my gosh, I can't wait to see. I can't wait to play with this guy. Well, I think he's a guy that's going to translate and hit the field a little bit earlier than maybe a Samuel and Pemba will. I think Gabe Harris will be a guy that is also an edge in this class. Another probably under the radar guy. I think Chadaria Uzodiribe, Coach Chud, as a lot of the prospects call him. I think he's going to get a bump to his salary after this season because what he's done, Harris, Damon Wilson, and Samuel and Pemba, that's a pretty good 3 for 3 in his first year recruiting for the Dogs. But to keep it on Wilson, Brandon, he had 15 sacks a year ago, 10 sacks this year. You want to talk about a guy that knows he's a marked man and he knows everybody's got a game plan for him, and then he still is just better than whatever the best teams in Florida has for him. He's one of those types of guys. I'm going to see him at the All-American game out in Texas. He's one I think Georgia fans should be really, really excited about. Not only is he now the highest-rated member of the class, it continues the trend for this class, Brandon. And I don't mind saying this. Georgia has assembled the pieces to have a better defense than what they had in 2021. When you stack 2022 and 2023 together, these are better recruiting classes. These are better players coming in. Kirby Smart even said it today. It's the smartest GPA, the highest GPA of any class he's ever had coming in. You have a lot of dudes at every level of the defense, and I think Damon Wilson, one other thing I see out of him, Brandon, is he changes the perspective of the room. You know, Mikhail Sherman, 6'3", Robert Beal, maybe 6'4", Nolan Smith, maybe 6'2.5". Georgia's edge rushers now, you look at Gabe Harris, you look at Damon Wilson at 6'4", you look at Mpemba, he's only 6'3" and some change, but he has a lot of length. And what Georgia's doing is bringing in those amazing first-round prototype talent guys that look more like the Bosa brothers, that look more like Kayvon Thibodeau, that look more like Chase Young. That's what Georgia is now doing with their outside edge, outside linebacker position.
Yeah, Jeff, you also wrote about that the other day when you kind of put a snapshot together of who Georgia might add before this 2023 class came to a close, and that's one of the things that stands out to me about Wilson as well. I think that Darius Smith was a little bit of an example of this from the last recruiting cycle, and I think that Wilson's a really good example of this right now, is that you want the long frame coming off the edge. You got to have the speed, the athleticism, but if you're smaller, it becomes a little bit easier for offensive tackles to neutralize you. And it does seem like, Jeff, the point that you're making is being borne out by who Georgia's pursuing here, is they want edge rushers that are not easily pushed around by offensive tackles, I guess.
I think the main thing is, Brandon, is getting locked out. I think Georgia saw that with Nolan Smith. Man, he was the number 1 overall prospect, as athletic, as intense, as technically sound as can be. But when a 6'5" or 6'6" or 6' tackle got his arms on him and locked him out, there's really not a lot he can do to get to the quarterback. So I think you know what you're seeing here is just an evolution of the position where these guys are going to have bend, they're going to have length, but they're going to have the ability to get around those guys. They're going to be bigger guys, bigger athletes. I mean, like, look, Brandon, Georgia just signed a 6'7" offensive tackle that does yoga and has a 30-inch vertical at 295 pounds. That's an amazing athlete, kind of like another Broderick Jones type there in Monroe Freeling. And what do you want to get to go after a guy like that? That's number 11 flashing there on the screen. Now, Brandon, he can set the edge like everybody sees Georgia defenders do, but I think he can redirect and he can really go out and get the quarterback as well. Bull rush, moves, bends, coming around the edge. I think he's a guy that I wouldn't be surprised if he's a guy that, you know, ends up with about 3 or 4 sacks after his freshman season. That's
a strong prediction, Jeff. Really interesting. And Connor, you know, something else that I was saying a little earlier is that if you would have told me a few months ago or maybe a few weeks ago, encapsulate what this 2023 class is for Georgia, I might would have focused in on as good a crop of inside linebackers as I've seen maybe any team sign at any one point in time. C.J. Allen and Raylan Wilson and Troy Bowles. That's an example of a great collection of inside linebackers, and yet, lo and behold, as you're wrapping things up, I'm not quite so sure the collection of edge rushers here isn't just as good as that trio of inside linebackers, and if not, maybe even better. That speaks to the overall prowess of this defensive class, is the fact that you've got 2 different position groups here that you might kind of put in the historic category a year after, by the way, that Georgia may have had a historic haul when it comes to defensive back. Literally no one is recruiting the defensive side of the ball the way that Georgia is.
Right, and let's say they go ahead and they land Jordan Hall tomorrow. You know, you start looking two years down the line when these guys have really developed in their second and third years. Michael Williams, Bear Alexander, Jordan Hall on a defensive line, Raylan Wilson, Jalen Walker, Damon Wilson, Sam Pemba. Tell me when you want me to stop. AJ Harris, Dalen Everett at cornerback, Jaheim Singletary, Malachi Starks, Janelle Aguero at safety. I mean, like, there were some really, really strong defenses in the early tenure of Kirby Smart's time here, 2017, 2019. And a lot of those guys that were on really, really good teams probably aren't going to get on some of those, wouldn't get on the field going forward. You think of a guy like Chris Smith, who's developed into an All-American here at Georgia. I don't know if they're recruiting Chris Smith in this day and age. That speaks to where Georgia is right now in terms of attracting top-end defensive talent. And the fact that they've, as Jeff has pointed out, stacked them in back-to-back seasons at these positions, they're going to – guess what? They're going to do it again in 2024. Like, they're going to sign another elite crop, probably the best crop of defenders in the country next year. And that just speaks to where this Georgia program is right now. And I'm curious for your take on this, BA. You know, you're clearly the biggest Georgia fan here among us. How would you assess this class? What is your excitement level about this class? Because comparative to past years, there have not been some huge fireworks. And maybe, you know, with the way recruiting is covered nowadays, some of the, you know, air has gone out of the balloon. But it's still a number 2 overall class, and it's still one of the better signing halls that Kirby Smart has had in his time here.
Yeah, to me, it comes down to 2 things. And, Jeff, I'll let you weigh in on both the things that I say about this. Right after Georgia won the national championship, what I said was about the 2021 defense is that its legacy at Georgia may very well be that it produces a defense eventually that's even better than the one that Georgia had in 2021. I think you see more of the fruit of that coming together, where obviously there are prototypes. There are proofs of concept of, hey, you know, come to Georgia and be like what Trayvon Walker was, what Nakobe Dean was, or what, you know, Jordan Davis was, or Devontae Wyatt was. And clearly that's a pretty effective recruiting message. And you see that, you know, kind of paying off here with this class, which I really, really enjoy. And Connor, the other thing, to answer your question, that I find so nice about this Georgia class, admittedly as a Georgia partisan here, is it is an example that right now Georgia is well fortified against all of the weirdness that's taking place in college football. There's transfer portal, there's NIL, there is a lot of uncertain foundation that the sport rests on right now, and Georgia is not moved by that very much here at the moment. They didn't get everybody they would like to have gotten, but they certainly got plenty. They kept pace with an elite class at a time in which a lot in college football isn't quite guaranteed the way that it was in the past. So to me, this may not rank as the best class Georgia has had under Kirby Smart, but I certainly would rank it among the more significant classes because it's an example to me, Jeff, of it still being business as usual at Georgia in terms of, you know, getting recruits, keeping the train on the tracks, replenishing the roster with elite talent at a time in which the way in which you do that has never felt more different. From that standpoint, this class feels really significant to me because of the message that it sends.
I think I'll take that one on, Brandon. I think it's the best defensive class. I don't know if your overall things make you think about running back or make you think about maybe the quarterback position, for example, and maybe a 5-star offensive guard to go along with 5-star offensive tackle. I think defensively it's the best class. I think for something I think both of you guys just hinted on, I think, you know, this makes 8 of the top 11 recruits in the class the defensive side of the ball. Should Jordan Big Baby Hall also choose the Dogs tomorrow, that would be 9 out of 12, Brandon. And I think there was a point I really liked, I think that both of you kind of echoed. Brandon, 3 of those are at linebacker, and 3 of those are at outside linebacker. And that came after a year where Georgia went buku crazy of defensive tackle type prospects. The Michael Williams is a sort, and also the back end with the safeties. But it's not like there are gaps in this class. I mean, Jonelle Aguero, AJ Harris. I think Georgia's entire 2 deep is quickly going to become, within a year, top 100 prospects on defense. And, you know, who else can say that? Everybody remembers these great Kirby Smart defenses, and they were revered. But let's be frank, they kind of, I wouldn't say hid, but those were some fifth-year seniors that got on the field. They had to go get a Darion Kendrick. They had to kind of, work with it because those 5 first-rounders on defense kind of covered up some holes. Brandon, I don't see the holes, and I think about one thing you always used to say. You use the risk management approach to the fandom of how you follow recruiting. Just stack up a bunch of rated guys, and if you get 4, one of them is going to be really good.
Yeah.
Well, I think Georgia has ratcheted that up to an extreme, Brandon, it's not just really good or being a core starter. I think it's Georgia's going to get so many guys that one of them is going to be an All-American or one of them is going to be an All-SEC guy. They have so many players at certain positions now where, like I said, so I don't know how in the world a linebacker would follow this class and the 2022 class with Jalen Walker, C.J. Washington, a lot, E.J. Lightsey. Folks, E.J. Lightsey is probably one of the most unheralded guys of the 22 recruiting class. I saw him late in the year. Brandon, he's put on like 25 pounds, and everybody knows they lost C.J. Washington to that neck injury. But, dude, E.J. Lightsey looks like another guy that's going to show up pretty quickly in his Georgia career as well. And somehow Georgia gets 3 more guys this year, and they're going to get another guy, the number 2 linebacker in the country next year. I think what they've done is they demonstrated they can develop guys and get you to the NFL when everybody else is worried about reps and playing time and positions. And, for a lot of things I do here on the trail, Brandon, a lot of offensive players tell me, what's a great thing about playing for Georgia is you get battle tested every day against that defense, because if you can make plays against those guys and if you can figure out how to make plays against those guys, you can do it against anybody.
No, I think you're right about that. And Connor, to kind of further this point, and listen, I want to be very careful how I say this because I have great reverence for the 2017 Georgia Bulldogs. I would take a bullet for the 2017 Dogs. I really would. But when you look at the guys that are making key contributions to that defense, by the way, that's an SEC champion and a college football playoff team and came within an eyelash of winning a national championship. When you look at that 2017 defense, I'm not quite sure how many guys on that defense would be starting on this and future Georgia defenses, and that's a team that made the college football playoff. And yet when you look at the future, boy, it's amazing how much the talent has been upgraded even from that high standard going back to 2017.
Yeah, I think you're comfortable taking that bullet because you got the Clark Griswold vest on there. I just think you even look at some of the, let's say some of the non-top 100 guys, because we've seen this consistently with this Georgia defense where guys have come in and outperformed their perceived recruiting rankings. Jamon Dumas-Johnson is the most recent example, but Jordan Davis, Eric Stokes, and some guys, because we'll have to deal with this eventually. Why isn't top 100 recruit X not playing right now? Well, there's a very real chance a guy like a Chris Peel, who is number 170 overall right now, develops into being a really good player. Jamal Jarrett, a monster defensive lineman whose ranking is all over the place because some recruiting service, I don't believe, value the zero technique the same way other ones do, if you look at sort of the way his rankings go right there. So I just think as a whole, and even you've seen guys like C.J. Allen, who the recruiting industries are starting to catch on to the guys Georgia recruits on defense, where C.J. Allen, when he committed, was a 300, I believe not even a 4-star recruit by the time he committed. And when he commits to Georgia and then he has the senior season that he has, along with all the athletic traits that he has, ends up finishing as a top 100 overall player, it speaks to how this community, this recruiting community, views what Georgia is doing. Because, yes, as Jeff points out, there are a lot of really talented players in this class. But there are guys even lower ranked in this cycle, guys like Chris Peel, guys like Justin Rhett, who was committed to Notre Dame for a time, that would love to take guys from this Georgia class, and they just can't. And that speaks to the reality of, what the defensive prowess is right now of the Georgia football program, where, look, if you're a defensive player out there, whether you're a defensive lineman, an outside linebacker, an inside linebacker, cornerback, or safety, if you want to get developed into a first-round pick and play, not necessarily start, but you're going to find reps if you're good enough in this defense. Georgia is the absolute best school for you. I think that's what you've seen in the 2022 and 2023 recruiting cycles. And guess what? You're probably going to see it again in the 2024 recruiting cycle.
All right, some final thoughts here. Jeff, do you think that Georgia fans going into tomorrow at 2:30 when Jordan Hall makes his decision, do you think that Georgia fans should be as confident about that choice as many of them were coming with Damon Wilson here right now? Because to be truthful, Georgia fans are celebrating this Damon Wilson news, but most people who are pretty plugged in had kind of expected this to go the Dogs' way in recent days here. Should there be a similar level of confidence in the air as it relates to Jordan Hall?
Brandon, I think they better be glued to their screens around 2:30. That's what I think about that one. Might be some more fireworks for this class. Brandon, I was doing some mental inventory of your question, and you threw it out there. I didn't know if you wanted me to take the bait on it. I think there's only 3 or 4 guys on that 27 defense that would play for Georgia now. I think that's Roquan. I think that's DeAndre Baker.
Sure.
I think that's Lorenzo Carter. And I have a soft spot in my heart for a guy like DeAndre Walker. I think he could probably still play on this defense right now, given his size element. But I think that's maybe about it.
It's amazing.
It's crazy.
Amazing the talent haul that Georgia's put in place, of course, these last couple of years, indeed. And then, Jeff, there was also a thing on Twitter today, if you want to kind of expand this beyond just the recruiting stuff. Travis Hunter was on Twitter kind of fanning the flames here of, hey, who would like to have a Christmas present? Well, I would. I'm always in line for a Christmas present. I've been pretty good this year, so I feel like I should get some Christmas presents here. What do you make of where things stand with Travis Hunter right now? Because obviously he has kind of put himself into the story today a bit at a time in which we're all talking about a lot of these other recruits. Travis Hunter is also getting some discussion here right now too.
Geez, Brandon, has 2022 not been good enough to you lately, man? Let's check the receipts on that one. And it's not just. I mean, let's face it, guys. I think Monday might be another for dutiful Georgia recruiting or team or portal reporters like myself and Connor. I think those might be active days as well, because you not only have Travis Hunter in the mix, you have Smoke Bowie, who was really shouting out "Go Dogs" to anybody that would listen on his Instagram feed the last couple of days. Dominic Lovett, the transfer possibility out of Mizzou. Also, Rah-Rah as well. I mean, everybody's going to call him Rah-Rah anyway. Why don't I just start now? That's a guy that, I've been told is pretty close. He's going to make his decision. It's Georgia. It's Auburn. It's Ole Miss. Rah-Rah is hearing a little bit from Bama. You also hear that Bama and Georgia are the principals there for Dominic Lovett. He was blown away by his visit. Brandon, one of those things that's kind of interesting about the Rah-Rah Thomas recruitment is, how the air raid kind of moves in their receivers back and forth like hockey teams do about in terms of their lines. He was kind of looking for, maybe a pro style look to developing for the NFL. He was kind of looking for more consistent playing time. And that's why Georgia is really intriguing to him. A little on the low DL slide note, just between friends here. At one time, Rah-Rah Thomas was committed to South Carolina. Who was the head coach at South Carolina when he was committed?
I'm guessing it was Will Muschamp.
That was Will Muschamp. Who his offensive coordinator was?
Brian McClendon.
Mike Bobo, actually.
Okay, there you go.
So, geez, isn't that comfy? He has 2 years to play. Brandon, he's really 6'2", 200. People I trust very much tell me that he could probably play an X or a Z, maybe even a slot a little bit at Georgia, depending on who they bring in to play the slot position. And I think Rah-Rah kind of complicates things with the Hunters and the Lovetts of the world, or vice versa. I don't see Georgia taking 3 portal receivers in this class, even with, expected attrition at receiver. I think everybody's going to love to follow Travis Hunter. He turned down Georgia once. Will he do it again? Here's a fun fact, man, Brandon. Travis Hunter is an amazing player. He's going to play in the NFL,
Yep.
But he's still about 6'1" and about 170 pounds soaking wet. I don't know if he has one of those big-time SEC bodies yet, and that's why most people call himself they like to think he's more likely to be a receiver long-term than he is to be a corner, because there ain't no corner in the world. Just look at Daniel Harris that's going to play for Georgia when they weigh 172, 175 pounds. So that's why the upside of Travis Hunter is really vast. I'd be curious to know what the man of the people like yourself thinks about it. Would you rather take combination of those guys? Is your food chain, do you want Travis Hunter over 2 established SEC players like Rah-Rah Thomas and Dominic Lovett? You just want that fun factor, that excitement level of a Travis Hunter?
So let me just say, Connor, you got breaking news. You hop in here with the breaking news, Connor.
Yeah, we have breaking news. Arik Gilbert is in the transfer portal, according to a report from Matt Zenitz. This move is not surprising. I think 2 people have followed this program. Mike Griffith touched on it this morning in a story that he had Arik Gilbert in the transfer portal for the second time in his college career, and it looks like his time at Georgia after a tumultuous 2 years here has come to an end.
Yeah, so this is pretty big news that's just coming out right now, and get a lot of phones and stuff like that kind of blowing up. We're reacting to that as we're talking about everything else, and this is obviously kind of an immediate reaction here, but I think that Georgia did everything that it could with Arik Gilbert, trying to really help him get back to football. I think that Arik Gilbert's a tremendous talent. I honestly, as a fan of him as a player, I hope I get a chance to see him, playing again and showcasing that talent. I would love for that to be here at Georgia, but I don't think anybody anywhere can say that Georgia hasn't done everything that it could to do right by Gilbert, to give him an opportunity to be the player at Georgia he could be, and it just kind of wasn't quite the time for that to happen yet, or it just wasn't quite kind of working out. So I don't have a bad word to say about Gilbert, and I certainly don't have a bad word to say about Georgia, how they've handled this. I think that this is just one of those things that just kind of wasn't, I guess, destined to kind of work out here. So, Jeff, I don't know if you want to jump in on the Gilbert news as we are learning it officially here. Putting his name in the transfer portal. Matt Zenitz has been obviously on top of a lot of portal stuff in the past, so we have no reason to dispute his reporting on this. Just not quite a fit for Gilbert here in a Georgia uniform.
Yeah. Apologies. That's my internal monitor. Anytime a Georgia player enters the transfer portal, I have a kind of like a Batcave signal that alerts me to that. I would say Godspeed and good luck, Arik Gilbert. I would echo the thought that Georgia has really tried and really laid hands on Gilbert and tried to really prop him up so he can have a productive career in the program. They put a lot of resources around him. My information, I don't even know how big a part of the team Gilbert has been over the last several weeks in Athens. And I think the main thing, Brandon, is sometimes the recruiting trail tells us a lot. When we look at the recruiting trail, and Georgia already has 2 tight ends, very highly committed, very supremely, stoutly committed, and they're still going after Deuce Robinson, and they're still going after a Walker Lyons, regardless of his status as a Mormon with his LDS mission coming up. That tells me that there's going to be a lot of open chairs in the room, and for me, that's something that you just watch and see it happen. Like, why in the world would Georgia need that many tight ends? Would they be recruiting that many tight ends down the line? Of course, you think about Brock Bowers will be gone after the 2023 season. Darnell Washington is very likely gone to the NFL after this season. So there's going to be a lot of turnover really quickly in that room. And didn't really ever make sense to me if you considered Gilbert a big part of the 2023 plans for them to be going after so many elite top-tier tight ends in this class. And I know a lot of people wanted the best for Arik Gilbert, and I think now I think it'll be very interesting to see, what type of place will work out for Arik Gilbert when you've had a home state program pretty close to home that really tried as best they could to really make sure he was a success in life first and not just on the football field. So it's a name that draws a lot of clicks and headlines, but I think he leaves Georgia with one career touchdown catch in Athens.
And, listen, I think that Arik Gilbert's a phenomenal talent. We saw that as evidenced by G-Day. Not to say that G-Day's the ultimate proof of football, but he clearly showed you what his talent is about in a situation like that. And, Connor, when he did not travel to the South Carolina game, that was one that kind of opened up some eyes for some people, and it became an indication that, Gilbert's not, not all that close to being a big contributor on this team here for the season. But I talked to a lot of people, even beyond, obviously Terrence Edwards, who knows Gilbert closely. I talked to a lot of people pretty close to the Georgia program on this, and the one indication that I was getting was, hey, he wasn't in their doghouse. They weren't mad at him. He wasn't in trouble. He wasn't a malcontent or anything like that. He just wasn't ready to play football as of yet, and there's just not much you can do about that. So you won't hear me say a bad word about him, and you won't hear me say a bad word about how Georgia handled this. I believe that Georgia was trying to do right by Gilbert in ways that really had nothing to do with football, and sometimes it's just not destined to be a long-term relationship. And unfortunately, over the course of the last few weeks, I think we became aware that this was just not destined to be a long-term relationship.
Yeah, I think you can look back to the Vanderbilt game where Georgia tried to get him involved, got him the touchdown catch late in that game there, and tried to go with some positive reinforcement there in terms of getting him to continue to buy in and be a member of this team. And then you look what happened in the stretch run. He doesn't travel for the Mississippi State game. He doesn't travel for the Kentucky game. We didn't see him in the SEC championship game down there on the field. This has sort of been trending this way for a while. And honestly, I think this speaks to some of the risk of the transfer portal in general, because, yes, Georgia's recruited the tight end position very well, but not every guy that you go in and get out of the transfer portal is going to turn out to be like a Darian Kendrick. There is some risk involved in terms of going in and getting a guy who you have some questions about in terms of, okay, why are they leaving their former school? And obviously Georgia, as you have said, BA, has done everything in its power to try and make sure that Arik, the person, is first and foremost all right, and worried about the football player aspect of this second. And so I think that just speaks to where the transfer portal is right now and how Georgia tries to go about using it. I think Gilbert, when they brought him in, was somewhat seen as a luxury. I know at the time George Pickens was still coming back from an ACL injury. But at that point, they had Brock Bowers in the building. They had Darnell Washington in the building. So I think it speaks to, on a larger point, when we're talking, ironically enough, about Travis Hunter here, it's not, in my opinion, the end of the world if they don't land a Travis Hunter. And yes, while he is a spectacular talent, and I'm not saying if he were to come to Georgia, he'd end up, transferring out like Arik Gilbert has the second time. But there is a risk involved when you bring in guys through the transfer portal. And I think Arik Gilbert has unfortunately illustrated some of that. And I do sincerely hope that wherever he ends up next, he ends up being all right, and both as a human and also as a football player, because I think it's pretty clear. Again, he was the highest ranked tight end of all time. There were massive, massive expectations placed on him and have continued to follow him 3+ years into his college career. And I do think that, especially as a young person, just weighs on your mental health so much.
Yeah.
And so to have that follow you throughout your career, and guess what? It's going to follow him wherever he goes. And so to have that, sort of reputation for being one of the great recent players in Georgia high school football history, that's a lot to live up to and a lot to constantly deal with. And so I just hope whatever the next step is for Arik Gilbert, he does what is best for him and puts himself in a position where he can succeed, not just when it comes to the football field, but life in general.
One point of order, he did not travel to Kentucky, but I did have him at Mississippi State. So I had him traveling to Mississippi State and to Florida. And I actually thought, I don't think he dressed out for Mississippi State maybe, but I had him getting off the bus there that day. And in my mind, I thought, ooh, maybe that's a good sign. Maybe this is an indication, because they only took 70 people to Florida, and Arik Gilbert was one of those. And then he traveled to Mississippi State the following week as well. And yet by the Kentucky game, he was kind of back to not traveling again. And I won't pretend to know why he did travel and why he didn't travel. But that was kind of the saga that we went through. Did not go to South Carolina, did not go to Missouri, did go to Florida, did go to Mississippi State. By Kentucky, again, he wasn't traveling. And I don't believe he was spotted at the Georgia Tech game at all. Connor, is that your memory?
That is my that is my memory there as well, that these last couple of weeks, even during games where Georgia didn't have a roster limit, he was not with the team on the field in pregame warmups.
And I want to go back to something else you said. We'll get ready to wrap things up here in a little bit after that, which is that when you take players of the transfer portal, there's going to be a batting average. And in some cases, you're going to really hit big. I would say that bringing in Darian Kendrick for the 2021 team worked out really well. That became kind of an all-SEC type cornerback for you. And you almost never really thought about him once he was here, because he was just sort of doing his job and covering that side of the field. So, you were kind of concerned about bringing Darian Kendrick in for a couple of different reasons. I would say that worked out pretty well. There was tons of excitement about bringing in Arik Gilbert, and yet that one has not really worked out too well. So when Georgia does utilize the portal and on a couple of names this year for the 2023 team, it's probably going to be a similar batting average. If you bring in 3, one of them's going to probably work pretty well. One of them may work a little bit. One of them may not work at all. That's just kind of the way that's going to go. It's probably why you don't want to make your entire roster dependent on transfers, because you can't be so certain of what you're getting. But it's also why you don't want to completely ignore the transfer portal either, because you do have a chance to get a player that can really help you, but you're never going to bat 1,000 on those kinds of things.
Right. I think Jeff did the research on this, but LSU run 15 transfer players last year. And by the time the SEC championship game rolled around, only 8 of them were starting. And the reality is, getting 8 of those guys to be big time contributors for you is a huge win. And so if you're, a Billy Napier at Florida right now, if you're a Jim Harbaugh at Michigan, who's really relied on the transfer portal, I think they know at this point in time, we might have to rely on the transfer portal a little heavier than we would perhaps high school recruiting. But the problem with that is that when you become so reliant on that and you're missing on key positions and key guys at those positions, it really puts you in a bind. In Georgia, they've recruited defensive backs so well that they haven't really had to feel the loss of Tyke Smith having to overcome multiple injuries in his time at Georgia. They've recruited tight ends so well to where Arik Gilbert wasn't counted on to be an every down player in his time at Georgia. But you look at maybe some of the other positions they've had where they potentially in the past have had to go in there. They lucked out that Darian Kendrick proved to be as good as he did. Mo Smith as well about Alabama all those years ago. Jarrell Reed, a safety out of the transfer portal. Lawrence Cager, a wide receiver. In some cases, it's really worked out, as you point out, for Georgia in those circumstances. But I think now, to tie this all back together, Georgia's recruiting so well that they don't really have to rely on the portal. They can use it to maybe try and fill 1 or 2 holes here or there. But as we saw in this last cycle, they didn't do it at all. And the way we've seen on this field, I think there's a good reason why that's been the case this year.
Is Jeff still with us, or do you have to step away? He is back.
Jeff,
still
with us.
Yeah, Jeff, let me ask you a couple questions here before we go, kind of expanding this, the rest of the country. The Oregon stuff from today, how fascinated are you by that? I would say that Hugh Freeze has been a pretty big winner here, stepping into the fray in the SEC and getting some recruiting wins under his belt here pretty quickly there for Auburn. Beyond just what's happened for Georgia today, what has stood out to you as being interesting as a way of getting ready to wrap all of this up?
Yeah, I think first of all, I would say that, Brandon, I think there's a reason why Georgia recruits high school players first and foremost and not out of the portal. Georgia has the ability to go get players that are better than what's remaining in the portal. I think Connor will recall when he told the assembled beat one time that sometimes when you go get guys in the portal, you get some of the problems they had their previous stay. Like you have when you have the ability to bring them into Georgia and establish your culture footprint on them. I think a great example is a guy like Chris Smith, about a guy who waited his turn at Georgia. But, it's funny, Brennan, to answer your question, sometimes some recruiting guys I talk to across the country, they're more name, image, and likeness reporters than recruiting reporters right now because some schools are going about things a little bit differently. I think, obviously, the Alabama class is staggering, especially what they were able to add late with a Keeley and a Caden Proctor. Not even counting, most people thought, I kind of thought that, Justice and Caleb were going to be there, and I also thought Rousseau and Smith were going to be there. But that's going to become, for me, a head-to-head between – and I said this on the Dog Nation forum. I think Georgia fans should be comfortable and be okay with Georgia being number 2 in the country next to Alabama. Why do I say that? Am I just trying to be some radical smart guy? No, because I think Georgia and Alabama over the last 2 or 3 years, Georgia has done a demonstrably better job at evaluation and developing talent than Alabama has. And I think the Georgia process, when it's that close to what Alabama brought in, is just going to be just fine in terms of Georgia's going to get more out of their guys, or they might even get better guys, their guys that are different than what Alabama got. I think there were some domino effects in terms of, I think Bo Nix coming back changed a lot of things for Oregon, especially with a couple quarterbacks as well. I think the Raiola decision changed a couple things with a couple quarterbacks, with notably Ohio State grabbing another quarterback in this class, which meant another program grabbed another quarterback, and then another program grabbed another quarterback. I think around the country you do see, though, there's some schools that are recruiting with NIL. I think one of the bigger stories in the SEC, Brandon, I'm not kind of preaching to the choir here, playing to a bit here, but I think it's pretty toxic what's quickly developing there at Florida. I don't know if you and Connor have made these points before, but I think if you asked a lot of Florida fans if you'd rather had Dan Mullen's first class or Billy Napier's first class, who's armed with some NIL money, I think you probably choose Dan Mullen's first class in Florida. And that's kind of staggering considering what he needed to do and the way their season kind of ended and how they're kind of losing out on some guys late. Those are some national storylines that I think really sound juicy to me. I'm going to tell you this. I think the big transfer portal season might come after spring practice, especially for a program like a Colorado, as Deion Sanders continues to make waves across the country, especially on that side of the on that side of the country with Pac-10 and Big Ten schools maybe. Meanwhile, the Georgia Bulldogs, they are as strong as ever, my friend.
That's very, very well said. Connor, how about a final thought from you here? Oh, but by the way, Jeff, did Merriweather and Cottrell ever sign?
I don't think those two NILs have came through yet. Excuse me, those LOIs have came through yet. Cottrell was a guy, obviously, that there was some speculation about, would he be in the class? This might be a situation where there would be a delay before they sign. Merriweather, conveniently, Brandon, is a guy that will not be able to show up until May regardless. So I don't think there's really a push or a rush to get that LOI in. You got to think, though, Brandon, I'm not trying to, drop any conspiracy bombs on anybody, but for Georgia to flip a young man from a in-state school where he was committed to Central Florida, you have to believe that he is going to be a Georgia Bulldog. And I'll even argue this. He should be a Georgia Bulldog. If you wanted to get me in a room and start talking about football, I would say his senior year tape looks every bit as good as perhaps the tape from Bo Hughley earlier today. Brandon, it's kind of funny how much news happened today with this class that when Bo Hughley, which was probably not a surprise to Dog Nation readers, We didn't ever really kind of fed the flames about him wavering or him not going to be a Georgia Bulldog, because we had some pretty good information on what Bo Hughley was going to eventually do. That his 10 a.m. signing was really kind of more of an affirmation than anything crazy.
Connor, how about a final thought from you? By the way, the reason why I'm dressed this way is because we're about to go do something Christmas-oriented with my family, so it's going to be outside. It's cold.
Are you going to recreate a Christmas Vacation? Are you having Charlie put all the lights up and untangle?
We're actually going to go out into the woods, and we're going to dig up a Christmas tree out of the ground. We're going to put it on top of our station wagon and then drive back. That's what we're going to be doing.
Watch out for those 18-wheelers. They're pretty aggressive out there on the roads, as I understand.
I have heard that.
Connor, he looks more like John Candy in Plane, Trains, and Automobiles than Griswold, man. Come on now.
See, I was gonna say that red vest reminds me a little bit of Marty McFly from Back to the Future. But all in all, it's a great day for the Georgia football program. They sign, as it stands right now, I think 23, potentially 24, whenever Damon Wilson's officially comes in. Players that are going to help this program. It is built through high school recruiting. I think Jeff hit the nail on the head. I think you have to trust Georgia's evaluations at this point in time with the way that they have found guys that fit into their program and want to stay and help and build and win championships. And when you stack this recruiting class on top of what they did in 2022, on top of what they did in 2021, which ironically was the one time it wasn't a top 3 overall recruiting class, but you look at some of the guys Georgia found in that cycle, Javon Bullard, Brock Bowers, Jamon Dumas-Johnson, all guys that were just not properly evaluated for obvious reasons due to COVID-19, but guys that weren't properly evaluated by the recruiting services. You should feel as a Georgia fan very strongly about the job that Kirby Smart and the staff are doing right now in terms of going out, finding guys that fit their program and get the absolute most out of them.
Very good stuff. We'll hear more from Jeff Sentell tonight before the Hedge is presented by Kroger. That's his normal Wednesday show, and tonight gets a chance to react to the full scope of all the recruiting news that comes out today. So we'll hear Jeff there. We'll read more from Connor Riley at DogNation.com in the days to come. We hope you're all having a great Christmas and holiday season here. Obviously exciting to see Georgia put the finishing touches on another elite recruiting class. And, of course, getting ready to go for 2 and 22 after that with Bowl Week next week. So stay close to Dog Nation on all of that. I'll see you tomorrow morning for Dog Nation Daily. Big thanks to Kroger for making this recruiting coverage possible. Folks, we'll talk to you again next time.